First off, let's start with a question. Could the war in Ukraine cause a famine in Africa? I know what many of you are thinking. Russia and Ukraine are over here on the eastern edge of Europe, while the countries of Africa are way down here on this large landmass. But the reality, VisualPolitik viewers, is that the war has turned the world upside down. We've already told you in a lot of videos how it has caused chaos in the energy markets. However, that's not the only consequence. The war in Ukraine is also putting another very important market, the agricultural market, on the ropes. Think about it. It is very difficult to live without oil, without gas, or with the price of these hydrocarbons skyrocketing, but living without wheat or corn is not easy either. In fact, for millions and millions of people, the lack of these foods could mean the difference between eating or going hungry. And you'll probably say, okay, but what do Russia and Ukraine have to do with all of this? Well, more than you might think. Basically because we are talking about two of the largest agricultural producers in the world. I'm sure many of you who are watching us from Europe, from the United States, or even from Latin America have noticed that food prices have gone up a lot during the last year. Well, you already know what one of the main reasons is. It certainly has been tough, but fortunately, in general, in most parts of the world, we are not starving. However, there is one part of the world where the same cannot be said: sub-Saharan Africa. We have told you many times here on VisualPolitik how in the world, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, so much progress has been made in recent years that, for many people, famines were doomed to be nothing more than bad chapters in the history books. And indeed, famine did seem to be on the road to extinction. The Russian and Ukrainian agricultural sectors have been key players in this. To give you an idea, Ukraine produces enough food for 400 million people every year, many of them in sub-Saharan Africa. But now the war has complicated everything. Grain exports from Ukraine and Russia are no longer as large and frequent as they were before Putin launched his troops on his neighboring country. And naturally, this has caused tensions in agricultural markets to skyrocket. And not just because Ukrainian Black Sea ports are constantly targeted by Russia, or because fighting has limited Ukraine's production, but because even sanctions on Russia now make its exports much more difficult and more expensive. The result? The likelihood of an uncontrolled food crisis has not been this high since the 1980s. So the question is, what initiatives are being promoted to avoid a catastrophic famine? Why were Russia and Ukraine selling so much wheat to Africa? And two other questions that may surprise you even more. What is Turkey's role of all of this in the story? Could Turkey succeed in preventing a worldwide famine? Today we're going to answer all of these questions, but first, you know what's coming. Let's look at some history.
Technology, production, and hard work.
If you are faithful followers of VisualPolitik, you will remember that one of the things we have repeated ad nauseum on this channel is that the number of people suffering from poverty and going hungry has been plummeting around the world over the last few decades. So far this century, extreme hunger has ceased to be commonplace, and that is mainly due to one reason: technological advances. And remember that if I were to ask you which economic sector has developed the most in recent decades, I'm pretty sure most of you would automatically think of industry or IT or something like that. Am I wrong? I'm pretty sure I'm not. And in a way, you are right. But do you know what? The evolution of the agricultural sector is no less impressive. To give you an idea, at the beginning of the 20th century in Europe or the United States, we could still find images like this one. However, today the fields of the most developed countries increasingly resemble this. Exactly. It is increasingly common to see how driverless tractors, irrigation robots, drones, and many other technological advances allow us to produce much more food every year, not to mention genetically modified foods. The truth is that in the coming decades, we may see an enormous growth in food production, a leap that we already experienced a few decades ago. Between the 1960s and the 1980s, there was a 180-degree turnaround in agricultural markets. Of course, I am talking about the so-called Green Revolution. The Green Revolution was nothing more than a gigantic increase in agricultural productivity on a global scale. It began in Mexico and the United States at the end of the 1950s with the Wheat Revolution and gradually spread throughout the world. The increase in productivity came about thanks to the use of new technologies, the planting of cereals resistant to the most extreme climates and pests, and the use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. As a result, countries in Latin America and throughout Asia, such as Mexico, Pakistan, and India, were able to multiply their production. Another well-known case was that of China, a country where the Green Revolution, along with the pro-market reforms implemented by Deng Xiaoping, succeeded in reducing famine levels to historic lows. We could say that the Green Revolution left even the most faithful Malthusian trembling, since it clearly proved that the increase in production is fully compatible with the increase in population and that world hunger might just be eradicated. And not only that, it also confirmed another trend that is now more than evident, that higher production does not mean more people working in agriculture. In fact, as you can see, fewer and fewer people are working in the sector, and at the same time, production is increasing. However, wait a moment, because not all of the process was quite so successful. Sub-Saharan Africa was the only region of the world that could not successfully join the Green Revolution. Why? Well, actually, for several reasons. The first, and perhaps most important, is that while the rest of the countries were already independent during the Green Revolution, many of the sub-Saharan African countries were still struggling to free themselves. And when they succeeded, internal power struggles and corrupt governments began to flourish, making it virtually impossible to develop infrastructure projects that would allow production to be increased and then transported from one place to another. Of course, investment in agricultural development needs sufficient infrastructure to be able to quickly export their production. That's not all though. For example, this same lack of infrastructure is also one of the reasons why fertilizer use is so low in the region, because transportation costs are much higher. And if we add to all this the extreme climatic conditions in many areas of sub-Saharan Africa, then we have the perfect cocktail to explain the underdevelopment of the sector in the region. This is precisely what explains, to a large extent, why subsistence agriculture is still the order of the day here, and why many of the countries in the region have to import so much food. And as the population keeps growing, then the problem is clear. The demand for food imports is increasing. And of course, faced with such a scenario, the Ukrainian war has set that ticking time bomb off. VisualPolitik viewers, this is precisely the #1 reason why the Ukrainian war has become such a huge nightmare for the forgotten continent. Check this out.
Financial innovation against famine.
Remember the anti-globalization activists? At the beginning of the 21st century, we had many people saying things like financial globalization was going to completely destroy the third world, and that the difference between rich and poor countries would increase catastrophically. Well, nothing could actually be further from the truth. In this video, we have already told you how technological evolution has multiplied agricultural production to the point of drastically reducing famines around the world. But what we have not yet told you is how financial innovations have also helped to end hunger in the world. We are talking specifically about the so-called agricultural futures market. And you may be wondering, what the hell is an agricultural future market? Well, basically, they are markets where you can buy and sell very easily agricultural products such as wheat or corn without having to move them all the time. They are instruments that allow you to guarantee your food supply in the future. This is why they are called futures. Of course, these markets are not strictly new, far from it. They have been with us for much longer than you might imagine. To give you an idea, the first agricultural futures market was registered in the United States in 1848 in the Chicago Board of Trade. But it was not until the 1960s and 1970s that we could speak of a truly global and totally open market in which to buy and sell agricultural products. As production could be sold in advance, investment in the sector increased and agricultural exports soared. And so, a new global market was born. Thanks to it, developing countries that find it more difficult to produce their own food were able to access a lot of new, much cheaper food. In other words, the countries of sub-Saharan Africa that could not get on board with the Green Revolution were able to make up for their production shortages by buying on the international market. And that contributed decisively to reducing famines. This does not mean, however, that they have not disappeared. For example, right now there is the dramatic famine that Somalia is going through as a result of a severe ongoing drought, which has already claimed more than 43,000 lives. On the other hand, the dependence of these countries on wheat imports also makes them more vulnerable to international market fluctuations. We saw this in the 2008 financial crisis, which led to a food crisis, and we saw it again in the 2020 with the COVID-19 crisis and the collapse of supply chains. But now, the situation is even more dramatic. Take a look at the countries which are the world's leading grain exporters. Exactly, VisualPolitik viewers. Russia is the world's largest grain exporter and Ukraine the 5th largest. And we are not only talking about grains, they are also huge exporters of many other products. Take the case of sunflower oil. Ukraine has a 46% world market share of this staple before the war. Their black soils, very rich in nutrients, along with reforms since the fall of the Soviet Union, have led the two countries to increase their agricultural production to the point of becoming the granaries of a large part of Europe and the rest of the world. Without going any further, countries such as Benin, Tanzania, and Congo import more than 70% of their grain from Russia. Precisely for this reason, the all-out war that is now pitting Russia against Ukraine has set off all the alarm bells. Prices have skyrocketed and food insecurity has once again become a hot topic. The question then is, what is being done to avoid another humanitarian catastrophe in sub-Saharan Africa? How is an attempt being made to tame prices? Well, let's find out.
And Turkey? What's it doing here?
We have already told you that Ukraine was, and still is, one of the largest grain producers in the world. Indeed, 72% of its entire rural population works in agriculture. But the war has been devastating for this sector. Between shelling, forced conscription, and Russia's naval dominance in the Black Sea, production costs have gone through the roof. In addition, it is estimated that 25% of all Ukrainian households living on agriculture have suspended their activities. However, it is not only Ukraine that has problems. Russia is not spared either. True, Western countries did not impose sanctions against its agricultural sector, and in principle, they should have a much easier time exporting to the rest of the world since they dominate the Black Sea. However, the sanctions are affecting them indirectly. Being excluded from international payment systems, having their logistics sanctioned, and insurers refusing to work with Russian cargoes, their agricultural sector is suffering like the Ukrainian one. Surely now you can better understand a graph like this one. So in case you're wondering, that's why bread and baked goods were suddenly more expensive when you went to the bakery or to the supermarket. Obviously, it's not just about bread, it's also about the bulk of the food basket. And of course, what may be an uncomfortable price increase in Europe or the United States can mean the difference between eating or starving in regions like sub-Saharan Africa. And so, the international community began to call for changes to avoid a food catastrophe. And you know what? This is when our old friend Turkey enters the picture. Turkey's role in this war between Ukraine and Russia has been ambivalent, to say the least. It has not sanctioned Russia, but neither has it supported, as it is a member of NATO. Turkey's role in this war has been ambivalent, to say the least. It has not sanctioned Russia, but neither has it supported it, as it is a member of NATO. And the country even has supplied weapons to the Ukrainian army. But beyond that, what is certain is that in general terms, it has sought to play a certain neutral role. Turkey has taken advantage of this conflict to make a move on the international chessboard and try to win greater international sympathy by presenting itself as the mediator between the two countries. And of course, being on the Black Sea and in control of the Bosphorus Strait, Turkey has played a key role in trying to restore grain exports from the Black Sea. In fact, together with the United Nations, it has been the forerunner of a crucial initiative to reduce world grain prices, the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And what does this initiative consist of? Well, very simply, Russia does not bomb Ukrainian ships carrying grain from the Black Sea. Ukraine enables 3 ports to carry out its exports: Odessa, Kornomorsk, and Yunsi. And Turkey checks all vessels and cargoes in Istanbul when Ukrainian ships enter and leave to prevent them from, for example, carrying weapons. Sounds good, doesn't it? Well, you have to admit that the initiative has been pretty successful. As you can see, both wheat and corn prices have been falling since the initiative was signed. However, there have been moments of great uncertainty because at times Russia has given the impression that it wants to break this agreement. This has caused prices to rebound every now and then. And the fact is that Moscow is playing with this initiative. They are trying to use it to get some sanctions eased. For example, when Putin signed his participation in July 2022, he did so for 4 months, and in November, when he renewed it, he did the same. Just recently, on the 18th of March this year, when he had to renew it, he did so for only 60 days. Why? Because he wants to tighten the screws on Western countries. And not only that, Russia wants to exploit this position intensively. Just look at this.
If we finally decide not to extend this agreement within 60 days, we are ready to supply from Russia, free of charge, to these countries all the volume sent during the last time to the African countries in special need. V. Putin, March 2023.
We can't be sure that this is going to be the case until Russia decides to withdraw from the initiative, if it does pull out. But giving something away for free, I don't know, that doesn't seem very Russian to me. They always want something in return. We have already told you about how Russia's strategy in Africa and how the Russian mercenary group Wagner, closely linked to the Kremlin, does not provide its services altruistically. Gold always comes first. But even if it were willing to do so, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to replace Ukrainian production. This is why this initiative is crucial for all parties, not only to lower prices on the international markets, but also to avoid a new food catastrophe in the most vulnerable regions, as is precisely the case in sub-Saharan Africa. The problem is that having Russia playing with this deadline for extending its participation not only generates great uncertainty in the markets, but also in the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people. At the moment, these are the expectations for 2023 in a market that is already very pressured.
The world cereal harvest will fall by 2.2% in the 2022 to 2023 campaign, according to the US.
So hold on, it's going to be a bumpy road ahead. But at this point, the questions are over to you. Do you think Russia will break its participation in the grain initiative? Will we see another made food crisis again? What solutions do you think could be viable for alleviating the situation? You can leave me your answer in the comments below. As always, don't forget that here on VisualPolitik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell button down there so you don't miss any of our updates. If you enjoyed this video, like it so we know. All the best, and I'll see you next time.